history of this particular bike.
Sure. This bike, Shorty Tompkins, who was a friend of mine, he lived, and an avid collector, and also a racer. He was the king of the Sacramento Mile. If you wanted to win the Sacramento Mile, you had to contend with him because he won it about 4 or 5 times in a row.
And what era was that?
Well, this would have been back in the late 40s, early 50s. And I met him, I worked at Harrah's Auto Collection, and I met him up there. He was one of their outside contractors for antique motorcycles. And so I got acquainted with him, and I knew that he had a Cyclone engine, and then he got tangled up with the Horseless Carriage Club of America, and he needed an antique automobile. So Marion Dietrich's in Seattle at that time had the world's largest private collection of antique motorcycles. He was the Pacific Northwest Harley Davidson distributor, and so he wanted this particular Cyclone, and so he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, Shorty, I've got a couple of automobiles that I'll give you a choice of whichever one you want. I'll trade you straight across for your Cyclone." And Shorty said, "Well, I have to think about that." And then he went up to Seattle and fell in love with an Apperson Jackrabbit. So the trade was made, and then Marion had 2 Cyclones. He had a privateer board tracker that somebody had built up, a Cyclone engine in a rigid Indian loop frame, a 1909 frame, and had one of the early flying Merkel telescopic front fork on it. And Marion had that. He had 2 of them. And, well, I mean, Marion used to stop by. I had in fact, I still have it. I got 1912 Model 7C Excelsior, which was the first production motorcycle to break 100 miles an hour. And they're few and far between, the ones with the big engine. And so Marion coveted that, and he kept coming by trying to whacker me out of it, and so my first wife divorced me and left me with a house full of echoes. And Marion called one time shortly after, and he said, "How you doing?" And I told him, "Well, I've been better, but then I've been a whole lot worse too." And I told him what had happened. He said, "Well, we could see that coming. You got any time?" I was working for International Paper Company in the maintenance department. And he says, "You got any time coming down at the mill? Vacation time?" I said, "Oh yeah, I got a couple of months." And he said, "Well, why don't you've had a kind of a tough road to pull for a while, why don't you just take a week off and come up to Seattle and book in with Molly and me, and we'll paw through my stuff." I thought, "Hey, you got a deal." So I went up there, and he lived down on the shore of Lake Washington in a beautiful house that, it would put a sorority house to shame. That is, it was really something. And it was a split level, had a daylight basement, and the daylight basement was the rumpus room, had a dance floor in it, and then a bar at the end. And so we go out and paw through his stuff all over Seattle, and then come back to the house. And while Molly's cooking supper, Marion said, "Well, let's go on down and have a couple down at the bar." So we go downstairs, and so I gravitated always. He had 2 rows of motorcycles on the dance floor. There were about 20 bikes there.
That's good place for him.
Yeah, exactly. And they were
Or track.
his favorite bikes. He had, oh man, he had some rare stuff that, we had one bike that had 7 miles on it. It had belonged to a dealer, and the dealer had passed away, and the wife couldn't part with it.
And what vintage was it?
It was about a 1913 or 14.
Harley?
No, it was an oddball name. I'm having a heck of a time with names. It'll come to me in a while. But anyway, his choice stuff, and down at the end, there were these 2 Cyclones facing each other, and I would always gravitate to the end of the line, and I'm looking this one over, and he comes down and says, "Boy, you are really hooked on these Cyclones." And I said, "Well, you know, Marion, if I was to have my choice of all the stuff that you have in your collection that I've seen, this Cyclone would be it." And he said, "Well, you know, I kind of feel the same way about it." He said, "Tell you what, if you really want it, there are 2 things you're going to have to do." And I said, "Well, what's that?" He said, "Well, first you're going to have to outlive me." He said, "That's probably not too much of a problem." And I said, "Well, probably not. I was just a punk kid." So, he says, "But then the next one is after I'm gone, you're going to have to deal with Molly. And God help you." Because she ran the business affairs in the office. That is, she was the boss lady. And so,
Kind of like mine.
yeah, well, yeah. But she was a keeper, just like yours. So, anyway, came home and thought about it, and then I decided, well, I've had enough of this way of living here. I wasn't getting anywhere, and so I had taken a vacation and went up to Reno and went through Harris Auto Collection, and then I went on down, saw my folks down on the Russian River, and then I came back home. I had a lot of time driving along to think about things. I thought, well, when I get all of the indebtedness and so forth paid off from this divorce, that auto collection looks like one heck of a nice place to work. I think I'll give it a shot. So, so that's what I did.
You quit the paper company?
Yeah, I quit the paper company and went over the hill. It was in January of 1967, and I went over there, and they said, well, I went down to the main office and put in an application, and the nice young man said, well, sorry, but we generally don't hire until about March or April. This is our slack season, so you're going to have to wait. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll look around for something to do here. I had an upholstery shop at one time, and so I went looking. And anyway, about that time, the assistant manager, who I had become acquainted with back in September, when I was there on my vacation, his brother was from my hometown out at Albany there. His brother was state police sergeant out there, and I was there. When I was there, I noticed that they had one of their Indians. They had the placard on it wrong. It was what we used to call the cornbinder Indian. You remember the 1907 that had instead of the chain, it had the little gear on the primary instead of a chain, and the engine ran backwards because anyway, it was just a 1 year only thing and really rare. Well, they had it tagged as a 1909. And I said, no, this is a 1906. Tell you what, when I get home, I'll go through my collection of literature and I will copy off the 7 catalog and ship it down to you so that
You can correct this.
yes. And he says, okay, well, I'll pull a placard right now. And so he did, and he says, so you're from Albany, Oregon? Yeah. And he says, I have a brother living there. And I says, yes, I know your brother, and I also know his son, your nephew. He and I were in the National Guard together. And so when I showed up there in January to go to work, Paul came through and he came on and said, what the hell are you doing here now? And I says, I'm here to go to work. And he said, oh my God. Oh, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, what do you need? I'm an upholsterer. And he said, well, no, we're full. We've got 3 guys there, and normally we cut down this time of year by attrition, and we've got a couple of guys retiring, but we're not planning on replacing them until March or April. And he says, oh boy, man, I wish I could help you, but you know, there's only one thing that we could use right now, and we're desperate. And I said, well, what's that, Paul? And he says, we need somebody that knows how to operate a heliarc welder. And I said, well, Paul, you may not believe this, but I happen to be a certified aircraft welder. I was certified by the Navy. I was an aviation metalsmith in the Navy. And so I said, but don't take my word for it. Where's your machine? I'll show you. And he said, by God, you're on. So we go back to the boat and aircraft department where the thing was set up, and oh man, that table was a mess. There was little dabs of tungstens laying on there with hemorrhoids on them. It was god awful, and they had the machine set wrong, and they were trying to weld reverse polarity. And, oh God. So he said, well, I'll go get you a hood. And so he went and borrowed a hood while I cleaned the mess up and reset the machine, and I started in. I found some little pieces, and I stuck one together for a butt weld and then made a lap weld. And so I had finished the butt weld and brushed it aside and started on the other one, and he tapped me on the shoulder and says, shut her off. I thought, oh God, here we go. So I shut it off, and he says, he was looking at that, man, that's beautiful. And he says, when can you start? And I said, well, let's see, it's 11 o'clock. You break for an hour. How about 1 o'clock? He says, well, how about Monday? And I says, well, no, how about tomorrow? He said, God almighty, you're eager. And I says, no, just hungry. So he said, well, let's see, this is Thursday. Tomorrow's payday. This is the last day of the pay period. So the pay period starts you show up tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. By golly, you're on. So I went in, and that opened the door for me, and I got in, and then I went from welding, finally, one of the guys in the upholstery shop moved on. His wife couldn't stay out of the joints, and oh man, they were having all kinds of financial difficulty, and so she was hooked on gambling. Yeah. So anyway, I went to work then in the upholstery shop, and I was there until Bill Hara died. I was with him for 17 years.
Mm-hmm. As an upholsterer or a welder?
Upholsterer and a welder, and then a little later on, I saw they were getting ripped off on non-ferrous castings. And so the manager at the time, I commented on the fact that, oh my God, this is awful. In fact, I'll show you a little later on. I said, what the hell is this? And he says, well, it's a gearbox that goes on the end of the steering column on a 1910 Packard to operate there's a little worm in there and a gear and an arm to operate the spark control. And it was just a solid blob. It wasn't a cord casting. I said, what did you pay for this? $400. I said, good God, you got ripped. And he said, I suppose you could do better. I said, as a matter of fact, I think I can. Tell you what, I will buy the stuff to melt it with. I'll get a crucible, I'll build a furnace, get the molding sand, make the pattern and the core box, and I will do that, keep track of my time. And if I can't make you a decent cord casting and bring it in for you under what you paid for this glob, I'll saddle my horse and be on my way. My God, you're on. So that's what I did. So anyway, a little later on, Marion came down, and he was twitchy. I don't know, it just he was on meds, on pain meds, and finally I said, well, what's wrong, Marion? He said, oh, the doctors tell me that they haven't figured it out for sure yet, but he says, I think I've got bone marrow cancer. And he says, I'm on medication constantly, and he said, I think this will probably be my last trip down here for the swap meet. And then sure enough, the next year, he was gone. He called me then, but this was in June, the swap meet was in June, and he called me in August, and he said,